All right, everyone, welcome back to Where Reality Meets Science. The Reality Meets Science podcast brings experts to you that know what they're talking about because they've got a list of publications or clinical experience that justify their opinions as being worth your time. And so I am your host, Dr. Tom Rafai, as you know, as a lifestyle medicine and internal medicine specialist. I'm a clinician, I'm not a researcher. And when I saw an article about intermittent fasting in which Frank Hu was uh, quoted, and I said, well, who would you think would be great to talk about this topic? He said, Professor Courtney Peterson, University of Alabama. And I actually said, "Whoa, wait a minute! That's where Doug Heimberger was." And there was a time where Professor Heimberger started the American Board of Physician Nutrition Specialists. He wrote an article, "If we build it, will they come?" And I said, "I will." After residency, and they called him up. He said, "Come on and do a fellowship with us at UAB." I said, "Can I just take the exam?" I'm so old now, Professor. I got to get moving. And it was a great story. So it's wonderful to have you here, Professor. And we'll call you Courtney from here on out. Please just call me Tom. And we're talking about the topic of intermittent fasting, and to the topic of everyone really trying to calorie manage. Although maybe you'll give us some information on how where there may be a specific advantage even at equal calories. I think that's kind of an up in the air, interesting topic to intermittent fasting and the different types. But first, you and your background and what made you interested in nutrition, and that's kind of different than food, as I've worked with chefs and realized there's food and there's nutrition, and they're two separate things. What's the passion that drives you to this area and your
Yeah,
background?
absolutely. So first of all, thank you for having me on your podcast. So I think for me, I'm really interested in the question of to what degree can food sort of reverse the pathophysiology of disease? In other words, can we take someone with a chronic disease that's lifestyle associated, such as diabetes or hypertension, and is it possible to actually reverse the course of that disease, and what people can we do that in, and so forth? So I'm really interested in the treatment end of things. So that's what gets me up in the morning. And I really got interested in this area for a long time. I mean, growing up, I was very sporty. My mom read these family circle magazines, Women's Day magazines, and I always loved going to the nutrition and exercise sections of those magazines. Got into like weightlifting as a teenager, which was not very common among women
Cool.
in the day. And just loved nutrition, but somehow ended up a little bit more in physics and biology, then ended up more in physics. And I liked physics more than I liked, doing biology research in animals, but I found out I actually liked doing biology research in humans more than I like physics. So an interesting split. So fast forward today, I did a postdoc in nutrition, obesity, and diabetes research at Pennington Biomedical Research Center, which is one of the
Oh
top
yeah.
nutrition and obesity research centers in the world. And they actually have done both the largest overeating study in humans as well as the largest calorie restriction study in humans, which we'll talk about. And my mentor there had also done one of the first studies, modern day studies of intermittent fasting in humans. And I knew when I joined that I was very much interested in sort of plant-based foods, and not diets, I would say, but foods or like food groups in intermittent fasting. And then in 2012, Session Pandas Lab published a seminal article on daily intermittent fasting, which we now know as time restricted eating, um, and wrote my first grants on that and have been studying intermittent fasting ever since for the last 13 years now. And I now run one of the largest research labs studying intermittent fasting in humans in the world. So we have a very large group.
I mean, this is what a great resource. Thank you for being here. And I think to outline it, maybe a bit about the terminology. There's OMAD. There's obviously the time restricted feeding. You're talking about 5-2. Maybe just the top three or four ways that people have been studied or discussed in the zeitgeist about intermittent fasting, because it's not just one way.
Sure, absolutely. So I would say intermittent fasting is a broad category of meal timing approaches where you're alternating periods of eating and extended fasting. And I recently served on an international consensus committee, and we are now defining intermittent fasting in humans as any time you fast for at least 14 hours at a time or longer. So when I think of different forms of intermittent fasting, I roughly group them into three different categories. The first type of approaches involve water-only fasting for 24 hours or longer on a periodic basis. And examples of that would be picking one day a week to have a 24-hour water-only fast. Another example would be alternate day fasting, where every other day you have a water-only fast. The sort of second category of approaches, I kind of think of them as your modified fasting approaches. They've also been called intermittent energy restriction, or IER. And these are approaches, for instance, like the fasting mimicking diet, where you pick 3 to 5 days in a row to eat a very low calorie diet. So we're talking about typically about the equivalent of one meal a day.
Mhm.
Another example would be alternate day modified fasting, where every other day you eat the equivalent of about one meal a day. And then you mentioned the 5-2 diet, which is very popular in Europe. And that's where you pick 2 days a week, which can be consecutive or non-consecutive, to eat the equivalent of about one meal a day again. And then the last category of approaches, which is the most common form of intermittent fasting, which most people know about, are your daily intermittent fasting strategies. And this category of approaches, you're effectively compressing all of your eating in a shorter time period, so typically 10 hours or less. So you're fasting for at least 14 hours a day. And these approaches we call time-restricted feeding in animals and time-restricted eating in humans. And we abbreviate that as TRE. And this last category of approaches, which is the type that I study, I consider it the least extreme and therefore the most accessible and practical for most people. And the beauty of this last category of approaches is there's not a specific calorie target you're trying to meet. So you can do them and maintain your weight, you can do them and lose weight, but they're far more customizable than a lot of other forms of intermittent fasting.
And they seem to have made what has unfortunately become a complex, world of, well, it's all the barrage of, excuse me, but we've come up with an acronym that Reality Meets Science, which sounds like crap, but it's actually CRRAHP, calorie rich, refined, and highly processed. Food that's just omnipresent. I mean, it's
Oh,
so,
yeah.
and we could even get into a discussion we had with Professor Marion Nessel on this
Mhm.
podcast, and Brian Reisinger about the farm bill and the commodity, the subsidized commodity crops at 220 million acres, and the little specialty, the specialty crops that are 4 million acres that get almost no subsidies. And then you end up with a $6 pint of blueberries in one end of a parking lot in Detroit and a $5 value meal at McDonald's as the ultimate manifestation. And you're going to a grocery store, everything at the easy access is what is going to be immediate gratification, hedonism. They're selling them at Home Depot. You've got it to check out. Forget about the fact that gas stations and movie theaters survive based on selling crap, or they wouldn't even be around. It's a real problem. That it's simple to just say, you know what, I'm done eating here. No more need to be so mindful that I have no bandwidth left and willpower, if you will. We need willpower for food, but also to write checks for bills and to deal with the kids stuff. Let me just keep it simple. And I think that's one of the elegant powerhouses of the approach, in my estimation. I guess one of the things from the clinical end that we see is, especially in a lot of my experience, though not all of it, because I've worked in areas of longevity, pure metabolic health, just dyslipidemia, prediabetes, where there isn't a high BMI, and it could be an issue of body comp, but we could argue whether how we want to define obesity. But in I think those people with a hungry brain, in other words, where the rigidity it turns out to be a problem, right? If they end up getting a bit hungry, they don't end up being able to control the fact that they need something to eat, and they maybe have kids in the house, so their temptation food is there, and then they come back feeling guilty and say, I couldn't do it perfectly. And we have to try to say, listen, it's a moving target. You're trying your best, and this is a way to control. And some have just been, and I would love your perspective on this, able to work better with a mindful eating approach of, look, eat when hungry, stop when comfortably full. Now, you will have to probably bring a food bag with you and be a little bit more prepared to pull that trigger, because when you get hungry isn't defined by what cultural breakfast, lunch, and dinner time is. But if you're a little bit ahead, and you know where your head is at, and you're not ignoring your hunger signals because of some other issue that would only take a few seconds or minutes at the most to address your hunger, because your boss is telling you to do this, or you have to do something for your kid there, or whatever other pressure there is, that may be a better approach that works for you. So somewhere in there we will find, but I like the elegance of the window. and I don't think that 10 hours is that hard. And at the very least, if you're going to eat outside this window, that may be where the willpower is worth spending. Are you really hungry? I mean, are we eating from habit, or what we call it used to be called HALT, hungry, angry, lonely, tired. We added S to it and called it stall, STAHL, because the sugary, salty, savory, there could be the reason it just tastes so, excuse my language, damn good that I can't stop myself. Maybe think about not having it in the house anymore. Maybe not out of your life. You can go hunt and gather it once in a while and enjoy, but don't bring the wolf back in the house and pretend it's a dog and then blame the wolf when the wolf bites you. And then obviously the hungry, the tired, lonely, and then angry, anxious, etc. Lonely, and then etc. STAHL. I have to go through the whole stall. And are you really hungry? So how have you managed that potential that there could be a hunger drive? Is it just a zero issue? I mean, I guess from the clinical end, it's hard to believe that there wouldn't be times where someone's hungry outside the window, and then how do you manage it? If in a trial or a study, how do you educate people that you might run into some hunger? Do you have tips and tricks and that you've told study subjects that you can use to not have to break the fast, or this much is okay and we'll just build it into the the fudge zone, if you will?
Yeah, so I think, interestingly, when you look at the development of the field, the very first studies we had on time restricted eating, the neat thing we found is that if you give people a simple rule, eat, don't eat, which is far easier actually to tell people, a simple rule, eat, don't eat, versus let me counsel you on how many calories are in, those cookies versus that hamburger versus that milk you're eating. People actually, when you give them a simple rule, like say, eat in an 8-hour window, they spontaneously lose weight without trying. What I mean is they're not stepping on the scale, they're not counting calories. And the effect that we're finding is pretty, I would call it modest to moderate. So there's a definite effect there. People lose typically about 1 to 4% of their body weight in a few months. My lab has recently done a clinical trial to find out, okay, how big is that calorie deficit? And it's about 250 calories. This is about equivalent of losing an extra half pound a week. So it's not magic. But what we're finding is it naturally suppresses appetite. And in the early days of research, so my lab, we were interested in whether intermittent fasting magically helps you burn more calories or if it suppresses your appetite. Like, what's the mechanism here, or what's causing these beneficial effects on weight loss? And what we found is that intermittent fasting does not help you burn any more calories. It's no better or worse than any other approach, but it does look like it's suppressing appetite. And we're still trying
Is
to
that early or
understand.
delayed? Is it right from the beginning, or is there a time point that it happens and you kind of prepare people? There might be a week or two, but it'll kick in.
We don't know. We think it's right away, as far
Okay?
as we can tell. At least looking at the weight loss curves, it doesn't look like it takes a while to kick in. But it looks like it's right away. There is an initial hump. So we found in both my lab and other people have found the first 2 to 4 weeks is more challenging. And there's been some interesting research that shows, a lot of people will say, look, I am not hungry. I can't eat breakfast, or I can't eat at a different time of day. Like, I'm just not hungry, and I'm just really hungry at this other time of day. And what's interesting is the research on Ramadan intermittent fasting, where they do dry fasting during the day and then
Yeah.
eat at night for the month of Ramadan.
And a
We
kind
found
of
that,
5-2, well, actually not Ramadan, outside of Ramadan,
sure.
those who are really adherent will do a 5-2, ironically
Yeah.
type. But yes, back to during Ramadan, dry
But
fasting. Yes, during the day.
yeah, but hunger hormones shift. So ghrelin, which is one of your key hunger hormones, will shift to start peaking at night. So it'll start adapting to what you do. But the punchline is your body adapts to what you've been doing long term. So if you are changing the timing of when you're eating what studies have shown is those first 2 to 4 weeks are going to be really challenging. They're going to feel really hard, but then your body's going to start adapting to that new
So there
schedule.
you go, 2 to 4 weeks, kind of.
Yeah, for the average person. I mean, we had some people who felt like they adapted in 2 days. Awesome. We had other people who felt like it took longer than 5 weeks.
Sure. And
So
can't
it's
people have their
variable.
6 or 8 hour windows when they want to start them? I mean, if they're a breakfast eater,
Yeah.
start it early, end it early. If they're not, start it late, end it late.
Yeah. So I actually did a systematic review of the literature a year ago, and it looks like if you look at 8-hour windows, so which are also known as 16-8 diets, 16 hours of fasting, 8 hours of eating, it looks like regardless of the time of day, those windows are good for losing weight. So whether that's a 4-hour window, 6-hour window, 8-hour window, any time of day is good for losing weight. Um, My lab has measured appetite hormones. We were the first to do so. And we found that time-restricted eating does change hunger hormones. We found lower levels of ghrelin in the morning, meaning people were less hungry. And then around evening time, around 8 p.m. in the evening, we found higher levels of PYY, which is a satiety hormone. It makes you feel fuller. And what we've assembled from both our research and research from other labs, which is really fascinating, is it looks like intermittent fasting keeps hunger levels more stable throughout the day. So you have less fluctuations in hunger, which is the exact opposite of what I would have expected.
Right.
I
Yeah.
don't know why people
Yeah.
get super
Counterintuitive.
hungry or not. Like they get super hungry during the fasting period. But what's really interesting about eating is it's similar to sleep. So it's controlled by two processes. There's a sort of circadian process. So this is like you have internal biological rhythms. And then there's a part, we call it homeostatic, but it's just a fancy word for like the less you've been eaten recently, the hungrier you are. So sleep operates similarly. So the cool analogy with sleep is these two processes help you sleep at night. So the first part of when you first fall asleep at night, you fall asleep and stay asleep because you have this sleep debt, meaning you haven't slept in a long time. You have this, we call it homeostatic pressure, but it helps you fall asleep. But as the night goes on, you've already started to replenish those sleep reserves. And it's the circadian system that keeps you asleep for the last half of the night. And eating's kind of the same way. We think there are parts of eating that are controlled by the time of day it is. So when it's, dark outside, you should be less hungry. But there are also parts that are determined by how long you've been fasting. But if you've eaten all your food for the day, for instance, and then you're fasting after 7 p.m. or 6 p.m. at night, and then you're fasting until you go to sleep, if you've already eaten most of the calories you need for the day, then you are not really going to necessarily be as hungry. So it's not necessarily a problem if you have a longer fasting period per se. So for us, we found changes in both subjective appetite and appetite hormones. We think there are these interactions between the circadian system and also like how many calories you've eaten or this homeostatic system. That big punchline of all this fancy terminology is people are less hungry, which is awesome. And we're not the only ones who have found people are less hungry. Lots of other labs have replicated these results. So they're pretty consistent. And one of the fascinating things we found in one of our studies is we put these continuous glucose monitors on people. So these measure people's blood sugar levels across the day. And in one of our studies, we had people eat in a 6-hour period, eat 3 meals in a 6-hour period, and we compared that against eating 3 meals in a 12-hour period. And the fascinating thing we found is that blood sugar levels didn't spike as high with intermittent fasting, eating those meals in a shorter time period. And what we saw in the data is, in particular, around like lunchtime and dinner time, because it typically takes about up to 6 hours to digest a meal. So if you're doing intermittent fasting and still eating, say 3 meals a day, you haven't fully finished digesting your last meal when you're eating your next meal. And as a result, you get something that's called like a second meal effect, which is this. And what we think is going on is if you're eating your meals in sort of closer succession, your insulin levels haven't dropped back down to their fasting levels. So insulin's still elevated. And we think insulin, which is a blood sugar hormone, since it's still elevated when you start eating your next meal, you already have extra insulin floating around in your bloodstream. So when that next meal comes, you have that extra insulin. And so it keeps your blood sugar lower because that insulin hormone is, helping all that blood sugar get into your cells. So we think there's actually, it kind of makes your blood sugar more even keel. And we know that that has direct effects in sort of lowering hunger because it's really these sort of rapid increases in blood sugar and rapid falls that really trigger hunger. So part of the mechanism may also be just keeping blood sugar levels more even keel.
Is it possible some of it is because insulin sensitivity improves also, or is it you think it's just purely the quantity in terms of insulin, not necessarily the quality of insulin sensitivity?
Yeah, absolutely. So the data is really interesting on this. So I'll walk you through it. So in terms of weight loss, it looks like regardless of the time of day, if you eat in an 8-hour window or less, you're going to lose weight, or there are benefits for losing weight. 10-hour window, the data are mixed. Some data suggests you lose weight, some data doesn't. It's about a 50-50 split. So I'd say not definitive for 10 hours. But when you start looking at other aspects of health, like blood sugar or blood pressure, it looks like there's a strong time of day effect. So when we looked at the literature, almost all the studies that reported that time-restricted eating improved blood sugar had eating windows that ended by 6 p.m.
Okay.
And what's interesting is we know the body has these internal biological or circadian rhythms. And what we've known for the past almost 50 years is that in most people, your best blood sugar control is in the mid to late morning. And it gets worse as the day goes on. So if you were to give people a blood sugar test in the morning, the afternoon, and the evening, their blood sugar levels would be significantly worse later in the day. Meaning if they ate the same meal later in the day, even though they're eating the exact same food, blood sugar levels spike higher. So it kind of suggests maybe you should eat more of your food earlier in the day. And what we're finding in the literature is pretty consistently that if you eat earlier in the day, that seems to improve blood sugar levels, primarily by improving insulin sensitivity. And insulin sensitivity is just a fancy word for like how good your cells are at quickly taking up glucose in your bloodstream. Like how quickly can that glucose get out of your bloodstream and into your cells?
Yeah, for any given amount of insulin.
Of insulin, correct. Yeah.
Did you see people when asked to stop eating at 6 spontaneously pulling their sleep time earlier? Because you imagine someone who likes to sleep at 11:30, going 5.5 hours might be more at risk for, I need something just before I go to bed. Is that something you attach onto this? Like, might be a good idea for you to consider getting to bed by 9 or 10 o'clock if you're. I see you sleep at 11:30. We're asking you to stop at 6, or is it not relevant?
We didn't find anyone actually went to bed earlier. If anything, we found that people slept less, which we were a little bit worried about at first. Because so we particularly have been focused on time restricted eating where people eat early in the day. So they really have that long fasting period between dinner and going to sleep. And we found people slept on average about 30 minutes less, but reported feeling more awake, more energetic, less fatigue. So we looked at our data and we looked, okay, is hunger keeping them up at night? Are they using the extra time to food prep? And none of those hypotheses were correct. We are now kind of thinking that maybe time restricted eating, if you really have this long fasting period before sleep, that maybe you need less time to repair and it sort of consolidates sleep. So we think there might
Maybe
be some
quality of
benefit
sleep is
for
improved.
improving quality of sleep, right? And if anyone on the podcast follows Brian Johnson, who's a very famous tech entrepreneur, he, is raving about how great his sleep is when, he's been
Yeah.
fasting for several hours before sleep. Now the challenge on the challenge.
That's an odd example, just to be sure everybody.
Sure.
Brian John, don't try to necessarily pull off what. And
Yeah.
by the way, that reminds me, when you have subjects who have multiple medications that are metabolic related, I guess particularly, let's say they're on insulin, but even blood pressure medication where you could require some caution regarding modifying doses around this. When I was at Pritikin, for instance, we would start people on, for better or worse, because they arrived and sodium levels just dropped, and we'd say cut either in half or out hydrochlorothiazide and blood pressure meds, because we said, tomorrow you're going to be by the pool passed out if you don't cut this in the media, because lifestyle medicine can be powerful depending on how intensive it is. Some thought about how you how you dealt with, and by the way, see your licensed healthcare provider. We're just talking about information that we hope feeds a better discussion between you and your licensed healthcare provider. That's just to be clear. But in general, the thought process around modifying meds around fasting when that change occurs.
Yeah, great question. So it depends on the type of intermittent fasting. For time restricted eating, we right now have a very large clinical trial in patients with type 2 diabetes. And we find we don't need to cut medications up front. And generally, we don't have an increase in low blood sugar or hypoglycemia. So we have a wait and watch approach for time restricted eating, and we haven't had to make many medication adjustments. For other forms of intermittent fasting, such as 24-hour water only fasting, or where you're eating about the equivalent of one meal a day, there are rough guidelines, rules of thumb. So typically the rule of thumb is to cut medication doses by 50 to 70% on those fasting days.
Mm-hmm. Coordinate
but
with your
definitely
licensed
work with your
healthcare
doctor.
provider. Yes,
yeah, definitely work with your doctor. Really important to work with your doctor. But if your doctor needs a starting point, there are a couple of articles on PubMed walking you through sort of treatment guidelines.
Absolutely, yes. Social pressures. How do you work with subjects are going to have the family culture, the work culture? There's these saboteurs. There's some supporters in life, right? But I mean, there's a lot of food saboteurs out there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, I have a couple of, I think, very helpful and realistic perspectives to share. So one, the good news about time-restricted eating is research in both animals and my lab, we have found that you don't have to follow it every day to get benefits. In fact, you can follow it 5 out of 7 days a week and you're still going to get a majority of the benefits. Not the same degree as someone who follows it 7 out of 7 days, but the beauty of life is this is not all or nothing.
Yes, thank you. Oh.
um, the second thing I can say is we have done exit interviews on a large number of participants now who have gone through these studies in my lab. And the very interesting thing is we find, and maybe this becomes obvious, that there's no one size fits all in terms of how many days a week we should counsel participants to follow these things. We find most participants want to follow intermittent fasting between 5 and 7 days a week. We have people who actually prefer 7 days a week because they feel like when they fall off the wagon, they struggle to get back on, regardless of what that health behavior is. And so we've kind of come to the point where like, okay, break days are not always good for everyone. And we have other folks who are like, I want 2 break days a week, and that's how I'm going to make it work. But we find most people can do it with 0 to 2 break days a week, which is awesome. The second thing I would say is I don't think intermittent fasting is for everyone. But I do think meal timing is for everyone. And I think there are sort of key principles. So general principles, I would say, we think that eating in shorter windows helps people naturally cut their calories. Research suggests it's not necessarily any better or worse than standard calorie cutting approaches, but it's easier and patients tend to like it better than counting calories. So I think that's a huge plus. But then the other sort of core principle is the earlier you can move dinner, probably the better. So if someone is super motivated, based on our current data, I would say probably the best time of day to eat is to do intermittent fasting, eating in a 6 to 8 hour window early in the day, whatever that is for people. That's not practical for the majority of people, fully recognize that. So the second sort of evidence-based approach that I would recommend, if you can't do that, is to follow the old adage of eating breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper. And the beauty of that is you don't have to shift meal times. You can just shift how many calories you're eating at most of those meals. So you can make breakfast and or lunch the largest meals of the day, because that's when you have your best blood sugar control. And then make dinner your lightest meal of the day. So that could be your celery, or it could be your fiber-rich, or your salads or your fiber-rich vegetables, make it your really, low energy dense sort of foods, and you can still have, normal family time with folks. And then the third approach, if that's not doable, then I would recommend skipping breakfast and doing time restricted eating, because we know that still has benefits for losing weight. It looks like if you skip breakfast and do intermittent fasting, it's good for losing weight and it's good for reducing oxidative stress in your body, which is sort of one of the aspects of aging. It's, best data suggests it doesn't have any major effects on blood sugar, on blood pressure, but weight loss has a lot of benefits. So I think that's nothing to sneeze at. And so that's how I would kind of if you asked me to rank the options out there, that's probably what I rank. And then I'd say, pick something that's sustainable. So I'll give you a great example. So, prior to having kids, I ate in a 6 to 8 hour window starting around 8 a.m. every day, which meant that I finished eating around 2 to 4 p.m. When I got pregnant, I was like, I'm not doing intermittent fasting at all. I'm not going to, I don't want to be a guinea pig, I'm just going to eat when I'm hungry. And the same thing with breastfeeding, is I just didn't want to experiment, because there is a little bit of data suggesting that if Ramadan is during a certain trimester of pregnancy, that is associated with lower IQ scores. And so I just didn't want to, experiment with that. And I just weaned my second child about 2 to 3 months ago. And so right now I'm doing about an 8 to 9 hour window, and I'll eventually get that down. But, I'm still, recovering from other things.
I love the way that you have weaved this into, ultimately it's got to be sustainable, and then gave a window into your own personal experience with it.
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely wonderful. There is a couple of, maybe as we're winding down here, the thought process, speaking like Okinawa, they have this harahachibu, right? Eat till you're only 80% full kind of concept. These almost learn to calorie restrict from, and it's all of Japan. It's not just Okinawa, but it seems to be more of an adherence issue in Okinawa. And half my background is Muslim and half is Christian. By the way, all my best friends when I grew up were Jewish, so I'm like, 10 commandments and you figure it out. I love everybody. But that being said, the hadith, or at least what the Islamic prophet Muhammad was supposed to have said, was 1/3 water, 1/3 food, 1/3 air. In other words, you're not supposed to stuff yourself.
Yes, yeah,
That may be seeing a lot of breaking the fast in Ramadan and so forth. Maybe that's not always necessarily done, and that's a really good thought process. But the idea, though, for some because we have had a number of patients that have tried, and we just came down to a conclusion that, and some days may feel different about breakfast than others, that look, let's teach you at least about eating when hungry, stopping when comfortably full. I like the idea that you could shift your circadian rhythm if you just power through it a bit. I like that.
Yes.
But then there are some approaches like the Okinawan approach of that seem to end up being such that eat when hungry but stop when comfortably full. The idea of knowing when to stop is something that's not necessarily and maybe intermittent fasting helps in this regard, because hey, it doesn't matter. You're in a window, do whatever. But we do try to teach patients there's a point in which you might have otherwise stopped if you're a little more conscious about it, rather than finishing your plate, for instance, which happens quite a bit as we're brought up with it. So, just thoughts around still having some mindfulness, not to just because you have this window doesn't necessarily mean gorge yourself.
100%. And I actually think diet quality is probably more important than meal timing, if that's helpful for your audience. There's conflicting data on whether it's, conflicting data from animal studies on lifespan, whether get whether diet quality or meal timing are more important for lifespan and other things. But my guess in humans is that diet quality is still, at the end of the day, probably the most important factor. That said, meal timing is far more important than we ever appreciated until recently.
Mm-hmm.
But it does not give you, doing intermittent fasting does not give you full reins to eat whatever you want. Calories in and calories out still matters, like energy balance still matters, So, I still think it's really important that people eat healthfully in the window. And we found in a number of our studies that many of our participants have reported, because they had a rule, to eat during this window, not eating during another window, it actually made them more aware of their food choices.
Mm-hmm.
They were able to make better choices. And then the other really interesting thing we found is a number of people said doing intermittent fasting made them focus more on meal planning. And I think meal planning, we often love to knock accountability strategies like stepping on the scale or prepping meals in advance. But if you can do them, they're extremely powerful tools.
Absolutely.
And I think preparing meals in advance is huge, because then, your food's laid out, you're making healthier choices, like you're just set up for success throughout the day. So we were actually really encouraged to find that intermittent fasting actually made people sort of more mindful.
Yes, and we have a kind of a foot in the door approach with this. For instance, the 5 keys, if you will, the methodology that we have. Accountability is one, right? Obviously, psychology, nutrition, physical activity, and environments. And environments can be food, social, or physical. So there's subsets to all of these, but accountability is definitely one of the keys. Now, it could be from God to a Fitbit, but and you can individualize it, but there's no doubt about it, whether it's information, motivation, or spiritual, or whatever the case may be. And the data on weighing is pretty clear. And we've had some patients that have been obsessive to the point where, we've seen not only the clothes come off, but the wedding band come off. And one time the contacts come out. And at that point, I said, wait a minute. Everybody has to be asked before you weigh them in. And they can weigh in backwards. They don't have to necessarily look at the number, and we can provide them general information, or they can just weigh themselves at home first thing in the morning, so they're not starving and dehydrating themselves all day. So there's some nuance there about obsession over the scale. But if you can convince people it's just a useful idiot, it's not a body comp. It doesn't tell you whether you're a good person or bad person. It's just a scale. And don't buy too much into it. It's not the sun or the earth now, but it's probably Neptune, So, it's in the planetary system. So it's kind of a psychology we have of tamping down the anxiety, but also recognizing its residual benefits. So with the binge, I'm kind of getting to this maladaptive psychology with those with binge eating disorder, which, by the way, frankly, I have in recovery. I lost my youngest brother to binge eating disorder. What are your caveats in terms of fasting when people who have that kind of psychological background?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we would certainly worry about that, it's, substituting, it's like a form of control, and it could potentially sort of cause some of those behaviors to reemerge. There hasn't been a lot of research on that. Honestly, most studies exclude people who have eating disorders out of an abundance of caution. Now, we find in people without eating disorders to begin with, it doesn't trigger eating disorders. So I think that's very encouraging. But I think if you have a history of eating disorders, I would just proceed with caution and work with someone, because I would just worry that it could, be a trigger for some folks.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. What this has really been so helpful for, I think, is that number one, there is the science behind it. Number two,
Yes,
individualize it. This is,
100%.
and it may be individualizing to the point where I did have, by the way, Northwest. Well, now it's still, well, it was Northwest back in the day. Pilot convinced me that he was someone who was in recovery from alcohol addiction, but he convinced me that, doctor, you've got to tell me I can never eat Burger King onion rings again. Don't tell me about a 5% fun zone or anything with these. I've tried it. It just doesn't work for me. I said, you've convinced me. Sir, you cannot have Burger King onion rings anymore. But that's more of in the areas of the psychology component, addiction, and then, maladaptive eating. So I really appreciate that you mentioned some caveats in this regard. But individualization, we discussed even working with your doc, because this is powerful stuff. This could turn out to really help you in many ways. And if it helps you get off of medication, maybe even or need less medication, help it work better, that would be great too. But might help you use less. You want to coordinate with your doctor on this. This is very serious information that Professor Peterson is giving us. And
I will say, I've had a lot of people in particular write to me saying that they were able to get off their antihypertensive medications.
Yeah.
And we found in a number of our studies it does lower blood pressure, and the effects are just as powerful as hypertensive medication, antihypertensive medications.
And if you think about it too, the spinoff of it does, even though it actually makes mindfulness more simple because there's a window, but a willful mindfulness ends up happening. And I'll bet you in the quality, there's probably even a higher potassium to sodium ratio. I don't know. I mean, maybe you can tell me if you've studied that, but that there are things beyond the calorie reduction in terms of the improvement in quality. And I guess we didn't touch on, do people become at all spontaneously more physically active? I can't let you leave without, I guess, touching on how do you approach that part of it, the physical activity?
Yeah, basically all the studies find that it doesn't affect how much people exercise. Now, we've had a couple people say like, hey, the intermittent fasting is interfering with my exercise because I either like to train in the fasted state or not in the fasted state. But that's a minority of folks, but by and large, no major effects on exercise. There have been a number of studies that have found that intermittent fasting, in particular time-restricted eating, lowers heart rate during exercise, including one in older adults. But that data is still sort of mixed. Some studies find a benefit, some don't. So I'd say watch that space.
Okay. And I guess last but not least, and this is not to cast any dispersions, and maybe I'm wrong because you follow this more closely than I do, because I think for an extensive period of time, Dr. Peter Attia was doing intermittent fasting and then was concerned over DEXA results showing that he lost muscle mass. And so what are your thoughts regarding longer term, whether or not the concept that protein can't be stored? It's not like carbs, it's not like fat, it's kind of like a just on time delivery. Can this be mitigated with resistance training? You just mentioned, exercise didn't go up. Is there a thought that over time we need to keep an eye on this component of body compositional changes and whether or not there could be some muscle loss over time with more tight windows of intermittent fasting?
Yeah, so absolutely. The old saying of the dose is the poison. So I think there's if you're fasting for too long, if that fasting interval is too long, that does have a bad effect on muscle mass. So there's been some research out of the UK that shows that periodic 24-hour water-only fasting does have a negative effect on muscle mass. And what I heard Peter Attia does is not what I'd recommend. So I think he was doing water, I think it was at least a day or two of water-only fasting, like really frequently. And I think he reported losing about 10 pounds of muscle mass. And I absolutely would not recommend that to anyone. So yes, I think that's a problem. With time-restricted eating, we generally don't see any negative effects on muscle mass. There have been a couple studies that reported negative effects on muscle mass, but they were clinically insignificant.
Mhm.
And they didn't distinguish how much of that was total body water. And we do know that intermittent fasting has what's called a natriuretic effect. So it does cause the body to release excess sodium. So it's a little bit like the ketogenic diet in that regard. In my lab, we found absolutely no negative effects on muscle mass. And I think we still have the largest set of DEXA data in anyone. So we didn't find any negative or positive effects. It doesn't magically help you lose more more body fat, but it also doesn't negatively affect muscle mass. So we think as long as you're staying in the confines of time-restricted eating with at least a 6 to 8 hour window each day, you should be fine based on the best available data we have.
Will there be studies now of this? And I've been a big fan of resistance training for quite some time. And I guess you could make the case, where protein delivery within a reasonable time period of resistance training. Will there be future potential studies on where people are wanting to focus on resistance training and how to acclimate that to intermittent fasting? Which I think you're saying that probably a good place to start is a 10-hour window, I guess. Correct. 8 to 10.
Yeah,
so I don't know that should be a problem, but
yeah, I would recommend most people start at a 10-hour window and then work your way downwards. And if you do 8 for a while and you're not happy with it, go back to 10, or at least try to eat, dinner earlier in the day. I think those are sort of 2 core principles.
Yeah. And as you said, it could be just up to 5 days a week and you still got a benefit. It doesn't have to do Correct. 1 or 2 days you can, but yes.
Exactly. And then on resistance training, I'm glad you brought that up. So there are a number of studies looking at time restricted eating and how does it affect gains from resistance training. And by and large, those studies have found no impairment in strength gains or in gains in muscle mass, what's called, lean mass secretion. So the good news is it doesn't look like intermittent fasting has any negative effects on basically resistance training.
Right. Within the parameters of Professor Peterson. Thank you so much. This was a great episode. And if you people like this kind of content, obviously, you're going to hear me say, like, share, subscribe. And really a pleasure to speak with you. If you don't mind, next time we hear of a study published, can we reach out to you and ask you, give us some details on what you've just published and dive a little bit deeper to help people find that practical where reality meets science?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Thank you so much. This is absolutely wonderful. Truly appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Tom.
My pleasure.